When you stop living for appearances, you finally realized how exhausting it was to carry a version of yourself that only existed to impress people who never truly knew you. The moment you stop shaping your life around how it looks from the outside, you begin building a life that actually feels peaceful on the inside. When appearances stopped controlling your decisions, you discover how much of your energy was wasted trying to prove happiness instead of living it. Choosing authenticity over appearances often means disappointing others at first, but it slowly teaches you how to stop disappointing yourself. When you stop living for appearances, silence becomes more comfortable because you are no longer performing for an invisible audience. The freedom that comes from not caring how your life looks online is the same freedom that allows you to breathe more deeply in real life. When appearances no longer guide your choices, success begins to feel personal rather than something measured by applause. Letting go of appearances helps you understand that peace does not need validation, approval, or public recognition to be real. When you stop living for appearances, you stop comparing your behind-the-scenes struggles with other people's carefully edited highlights. There is a quiet confidence that grows when you no longer need your life to look impressive in order to feel worthy. When appearances lose their power over you, your decisions start reflecting your values instead of other people's expectations. The need to look successful often fades once you understand that true fulfillment rarely looks impressive to strangers. When you stop living for appearances, rest no longer feels like laziness, and solitude no longer feels like failure. Releasing the pressure to appear perfect allows you to accept your flaws without turning them into secrets or shame. When appearances stop mattering, honesty becomes easier because you are no longer protecting an image. You begin to notice how much of modern stress is created by the fear of being seen as less than enough. When you stop living for appearances, your relationships grow deeper because you stop showing up as a role and start showing up as yourself. The strongest form of self-respect is choosing a life that feels right even when no one is watching. When appearances no longer guide you, you learn to say no without explaining and yes without justifying. The relief of being real is far greater than the temporary comfort of being admired. When you stop living for appearances, you realize that most people are too busy managing their own image to judge yours. Letting go of appearances teaches you that happiness does not need to be loud to be meaningful. When appearances stop defining you, failure becomes a lesson instead of a humiliation. You begin to understand that peace is not something you display but something you experience. When you stop living for appearances, your life slows down in the best possible way. Authentic living often looks ordinary from the outside, but feels extraordinary on the inside. When appearances lose importance, your goals start aligning with purpose rather than pressure. You stop chasing moments that look good and start choosing moments that feel right. When you stop living for appearances, your worth no longer rises and falls with public opinion. The constant need to impress quietly disappears when you finally accept yourself as you are. When appearances no longer matter, you stop pretending to be okay and start actually healing. Living honestly may not attract attention, but it attracts peace. When you stop living for appearances, your confidence comes from self-trust rather than compliments. You begin to dress, speak, and move in ways that reflect comfort instead of performance. When appearances stop guiding you, your life becomes less dramatic and more meaningful. The courage to live authentically is often born from exhaustion with pretending. When you stop living for appearances, you realize that approval was never the same as love. You stop explaining your choices to people who do not live with the consequences. When appearances no longer control you, simplicity starts to feel like success. The need to look busy fades once you understand that rest is productive for the soul. When you stop living for appearances, you begin to honor your limits without guilt. Real confidence grows quietly when you stop asking for permission to be yourself. When appearances lose their grip, you stop confusing attention with connection. You learn that being private can be powerful, not secretive. When you stop living for appearances, your happiness stops depending on reactions. You begin to value alignment over admiration. When appearances no longer define you, your mistakes feel human instead of shameful. You stop curating your life and start living it. When you stop living for appearances, comparison slowly loses its voice. You realize that the most meaningful progress often goes unnoticed by others. When appearances stop mattering, you feel safer being honest about your struggles. A life lived for yourself feels lighter than a life lived for approval. When you stop living for appearances, you no longer fear being misunderstood. You begin to trust your inner voice more than external opinions. When appearances lose importance, gratitude grows naturally. You stop performing happiness and start cultivating it. When you stop living for appearances, your energy returns to things that truly matter. The peace of authenticity lasts longer than the praise of pretending. When appearances no longer control your actions, freedom becomes your default state. You realize that real success often happens quietly. When you stop living for appearances, your priorities become clearer. You learn that boundaries are not rude, they are necessary. When appearances lose power, self-acceptance grows stronger. You stop seeking validation and start offering compassion to yourself. When you stop living for appearances, your life feels more grounded and real. You discover that you do not need to prove your worth. When appearances stop guiding you, peace becomes more important than praise. You realize that authenticity attracts the right people and repels the wrong ones. When you stop living for appearances, you stop apologizing for being human. You begin to enjoy moments without feeling the need to document them. When appearances no longer matter, you feel less pressure to have everything figured out. You learn that growth does not need an audience. When you stop living for appearances, you give yourself permission to change. You realize that being real is more sustainable than being impressive. When appearances lose importance, inner peace becomes the real achievement. You stop measuring life by milestones and start measuring it by meaning. When you stop living for appearances, your choices feel more honest. You begin to value depth over display. When appearances no longer define you, your life feels more aligned. You realize that freedom begins the moment you stop pretending. When you stop living for appearances, you reclaim your time and energy. You understand that true confidence does not need witnesses. When appearances lose their grip, your self-respect strengthens. You stop chasing perfection and start embracing progress. When you stop living for appearances, your happiness feels calmer and more stable. You realize that peace is not boring. It is powerful. When appearances no longer matter, your life feels more intentional. You stop fearing judgment and start valuing truth. When you stop living for appearances, your identity feels more solid. You learn that being yourself is not a risk. It is relief. When appearances lose importance, your inner world becomes richer. You stop trying to be understood by everyone. When you stop living for appearances, your life finally feels like your own. You realize that authenticity is the most underrated form of confidence. When appearances no longer control you, you feel more present. You stop proving and start living. When you stop living for appearances, your happiness becomes quieter but deeper. You learn that peace does not need permission. When appearances lose their power, your life gains clarity. And when you finally stop living for appearances, you discover that being real was the freedom you were looking for all along.